season now, and election day will be in May. This educational discussion will um, give us some basics and some and obvious and of course political context about what's going on in the Philippines, uh, what what the political landscape is right now, and yeah, hopefully we can learn a lot from each other. And at the end, we're actually going to have a Q&A. Folks will have a chance to discuss and register any questions or concerns that we can all hopefully answer together. Um, my name is Audine Tayag. I'm the vice chair of Malaya Movement USA. Um, I'm going to introduce some the rest of our facilitators for tonight in a bit, but for now, let's start with some webinar reminders. Um, I think folks already have heard this educational discussion is being recorded for notes purposes, lessons, and also we will be posting this content up later on as well so that people can um, benefit from tonight's discussion as well. Everyone is on mute to minimize sound and um, any surprises. Please send your questions in the chat, share your comments. But also, if you haven't introduced yourself yet and where you are in the world, please do so in the chat. This is being held by Malaya Movement USA, but I'm pretty sure there are also folks from Canada here. So let us know where you're at and say hi. Um, uh, and with that, can we go to the next slide? I'm going to pass it off to the next facilitator, Marte.
Hi, everyone. I'm Marte. I'm from Malaya, Georgia. And this is just a little introduction. For those who may not be familiar, the Malaya Movement USA is basically a broad movement of individuals, organizations, and formations that share the common objective of defending, upholding, and asserting human rights, democracy, and sovereignty in the Philippines. So the Malaya movement was formed in 2018 in response to the worsening human rights crisis and attacks on democracy in the Philippines under the Duterte regime. And specifically, the drug war was like a major factor in the creation of Malaya. It was a huge human rights violation that people felt needed to be answered. Um, we so fast forwarding to now, we've resolved to fight for Marcos Jr. To be held accountable for the crimes of his family against the people of the Philippines, and also to hold the Dutertes responsible for the crimes of their family. So that's going to include fighting for the impeachment of Sara Duterte. So for this ED, our objectives are one, providing an understanding of Philippine elections in general, and also what is at stake during these specific 2025 midterm elections in particular. In addition to that, we want to provide a critical analysis of the Philippine elections toward informed action. So the run of show is basically going to be, what do we need to know about the Philippine elections to start with? Then what's up with the 2025 midterm elections and what's at stake in these elections? And then our third thing is going to be, what are the issues surrounding the elections and what are the limitations of the elections? After that, we're going to get into some calls to action. And then finally, we're going to open it up for Q&A. So yeah, our first part is going to be, what do we need to know about the Philippine elections in general? So here's a little bit of history on elections in the Philippines. The real first presidential and vice presidential elections were held at the Tejeros Convention in 1897. And basically, during this, forces within the Katipunan established a revolutionary government that was organized against the Spanish crown. So eventually, Spanish colonial rule was ended, and the first Philippine Republic was established. And after that, a national election was held in 1907, and the Philippine Assembly was established, an elected body. Then after that, American colonialism took over the Philippines, and they kind of, of course, exerted their will on the Philippines. So later, the Tidings-McDuffie Act authorized the U.S. to draft the 1936 Constitution, which established officially the Commonwealth of the Philippines and unicameral National Assembly. Then after that, the Japanese invaded, and they set up like a puppet republic in the Philippines, which is known as the Second Philippine Republic. But this was dissolved after the Japanese lost World War II. That reestablished the Commonwealth of the Philippines. Then later on, after the Philippines got we use the term like baby flag independence. The Later on, the Marcos dictatorship uh, established martial law, and this did away with term limits in the Philippines and allowed Marcos to basically rule indefinitely as a dictator until the Filipino people overthrew him in the People Power Revolution in 1986. So because of that, term limits were reestablished. And this happened, like the reestablishment of term limits happened in 1992. Oh, and I'm going to pass it on to Arthur.
Uh, yeah, thanks, Marte. Hi all, Arthur here, based in Queens from the New York chapter of Malaya. I'll take y'all through a brief overview of the election process and touch a little on the political landscape in the Philippines. So, in the Philippines, all nationally elected positions, which include president, vice president, and senators, serve 6-year terms. And when the presidency is not on the ballot during the midterm elections, only senators and party lists are elected nationally. So this year in the Philippines, congressional and local elections will be held on May 12th. And the first regular election to the Bangsamoro Parliament will also be held within the general election this year after it was postponed in 2022. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, so who can vote in the Philippine elections? When voting in the Philippines, all citizens of the Philippines, not otherwise disqualified by law, who are at least 18 years of age and who shall have resided in the Philippines for at least 1 year, and in the place where they propose to vote for at least 6 months may register as a voter. But most importantly for us here in Malaya, USA, under Republic Act 9189 and amended by 10590, all citizens or dual citizens of the Philippines who are not disqualified by law, at least 18 years of age by May 12th of 2025, may be eligible to vote. So that's regardless of your immigration or documentation status if you're in the US. Unfortunately, if you are eligible to vote and haven't registered yet, the deadline for registration has already passed last September. But if you voted overseas during the 2022 elections and reside within the same voting precinct, then your registration should have rolled over, and you can see a voter roll on the website of your embassy or your consulate. Next slide. Yeah, so something new that the COMELEC or Commission on Elections is rolling out this year is online voting. So overseas voters can use any electronic device with a camera and is capable of connecting to the internet. And to participate in online voting, a citizen must be a registered voter within the 77 posts worldwide that are using online voting. And I believe in the US, all the precincts here in the US will be using the online voting system. Voters using online voting must pre-enroll or sign up for an account with COMELEC, and pre-enrollment runs from March 10th until May 12th. So it's about there's like about 2 to 3 month span for enrollment. So even if you've already registered as a voter, you still have to enroll again as an online voter. So really, our task here in the U.S. before May 12th is to ensure that Filipino voters in our community are informed of these changes and are able to register with an online voting account, right? I'm personally a registered voter in the Philippines, and if it wasn't for this webinar, if it wasn't for me looking up the details of how to vote in this upcoming election, I would never have known, and would probably still be waiting for my mail-in ballot, right? So this just goes to show, that we really have to keep our community informed of these changes. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, so we'll just go over some context setting on what the political landscape is like in the Philippines and what positions are up for elections. So in Philippine politics, there is no two-party system like there is here in the US, right? There are as many political parties as there are stars in the sky, and every day a new star is born, it seems like. So folks are free to swap political parties and political affiliations as often as they like, and they often do. So political parties in the Philippines are generally candidate-centered, patronage-based, and office-seeking coalitions. These often lack concrete ideological and programmatic underpinnings. There are so these are like, broadly talking about parties in the Philippines. There are, of course, exceptions to the rule, and I think others will discuss in a little bit, but this is quite often the case. And the political elite really control these unstable political parties as their electoral machinery. So we can take a look at some of the Philippines' most prominent parties in recent memory, right? The Liberal Party, PDP Laban, or the Partido Demokratiko Pilipino, Lakas ng Bayan, and Lakas CMD. So in 2010, following the victory of you can refer to the chart on the left here. In 2010, following the victory of the late President Noynoy Aquino in the presidential elections, his party's membership surged from 30 to 77. And we can see on this chart that they peaked at 117. And as of 2022, so the 2022 elections, they only had 10 seats left. Nowadays, they have less than 5 congressional representatives. When Duterte won the presidency in 2016, his PDP Laban party only had 2 congressional seats and then during the midterms under his presidency, it had swelled to 86. As of the 2022 elections, they had weakened to 66, but we also saw that 39 of the 61 representatives from Mindanao signed on to Sara Duterte's impeachment. So they're, signs that they're also losing political power. Marcos Jr.'s PFP, Partido Federal ng Pilipinas, currently has 13 seats in Congress. If the Filipino people are not successful in opposing him in the midterms, that number could very realistically quadruple or even more, right? So these party members didn't lose their elections, they merely switched parties. This political turncoatism in the Philippines really exposes where the loyalties of traditional politicians in the Philippines lie, and that is with their own self-interest. The fact that these politicians change political parties so often and so frequently reveals the truth that all of these parties are really just the same and they only really serve the ruling elite. From this alone, we can already see that traditional politicians in the Philippines really value political alliances and personal gain more than ensuring their constituents' needs are met. So, to further hammer this point home, right, we can take a look at the Nationalista Party as a case study here on the right. It is the oldest political party in the Philippines and in Southeast Asia, and throughout the years, they have formed alliances with the party of the sitting president. So they are currently part of the Alyansa para sa Bagong Pilipinas. That's BBM's party. That's BBM's coalition that's supporting him, rather. In 2022 to 2024, they were part of the Unit Team, which supported BBM and Sara Duterte. In 2016, they were part of the Coalition for Change, which supported former President Rodrigo Duterte. In 2013, they were part of Team Pinoy and allied with the Liberal Party, the self-branded opposition party in the Philippines. And before that, they were in opposition to Gloria Arroyo. Before that, they supported her and called for the ouster of Estrada. Before that, they were the party of Estrada. And before that, it was the party of Ferdinand Marcos Sr. So during the 20 years of his dictatorship. So we can really see most political parties in the Philippines are only a vehicle for self-preservation of these politicians and their families. There are really no ideals behind it. And never have they actually advocated for and fought for the welfare of the broad majority of the Filipino people, right? Can you imagine this nationalista party was a party of a dictator for 20 years and they didn't do anything about it, right? Can we go to the next slide? Consider this, right? Bongbong Marcos, his sister Amy Marcos, and their first cousin Martin Romualdez, they all belong to different political parties. So does does one imagine, however, that these three people have different political interests or ideologies? I highly doubt that, right? They all grew up in the same household. What is obvious is that although political parties do not serve the Filipino people, they do serve the interests of the ruling elite. So who are these, right? These are folks from the we have like a what do you call that? Like a rogues gallery right here on the left. Folks from the Philippines will be very familiar with some of these names, and they're almost synonymous with the regions that these families are from. Of course, the Marcoses from Ilocos Norte, the Singsons from Ilocos Sur, Coangco Aquinos from Tarlac, Magsaysays from Zambales and Pangasinan, Villafuertes in Bicol, Defensors and Arroyos from the Ilonggo regions, Ampatuans in Maguindanao, Dimaparos in Lanao, the Dutertes in Davao, Belmonte, Estrada, Eusebio, Cayetano, Villar, Binais in Metro Manila. That was a mouthful. In fact, all the cities in the NCR, the National Capital Region, are ruled by political dynasties. And every level of governance in the Philippines, from the town councilors to the president, is oftentimes held by someone from a political dynasty, right? Um, Next slide. Thank you. Right. So now that we've laid out the political landscape in the Philippines, right, we can take a look at um, the what the Philippine elections look like today. Right. So there are over 18,000 seats up for grabs in these midterm elections. For us overseas voters, what we are really concerned with are folks running for the national level, right? So we can vote for 12 senators and one party list group. So in the Philippines, senators do not represent a region, unlike here in the US, where they represent a state. They're instead nominated by the popular vote. So the top 12 senators elected by the entire country will then receive a seat in the Senate. And we'll talk about party list groups in a second. But in the local and provincial level, there are also 317 seats in the House of Representatives that are up for grabs. In the provincial level, there are 82 governors and vice governors that are vying for electoral positions. And in the city level, there are 149 city mayors and vice mayors and 1,690 city councilors running for office. Now, cities and towns in the Philippines are different classifications of government units, but in the Philippines, there are 149, almost 150 cities, which are usually larger and more populated and they have a little bit more autonomy compared to towns or municipalities. So of these 149 cities, 113 out of the 149 incumbent mayors belong to political dynasties. In the cities where there are non-dynasty mayors, members of political parties are also gearing up to try to unseat these incumbents, right? One in every three city councils are filled by their respective mayor's kin, and in the provincial level, 71 out of 82 Philippine governors belong to political families, and 8 in every 10 district representatives belong to political dynasties as well. Next slide. Thank you. Yeah, so we'll go over the party list system. So the party list system in the Philippines was first electorally implemented in 1998 in the 1998 elections, and it was provided for by the 1987 Freedom Constitution. And originally, it was exclusive to underrepresented communities or groups, which included labor, peasant, the urban poor, indigenous, cultural, women, youth, and other such sectors as may be defined by law, except the religious sector. So, in an electoral system where the vast majority of incumbents only pass policy for their personal gain, these party list seats were a way for these communities that are underrepresented in the legislature to advocate for their concerns and their rights. Right. So we have a quote here from the Supreme Court of the Philippines in 2001 about party lists, right? Such one tool intended to benefit those who have less in life and gives the great masses of our people genuine hope and genuine power. Unfortunately, a 2013 Supreme Court decision clarified that the party list is a system of proportional representation open to various kinds of groups and parties and not an exercise exclusive to marginalized sectors. Since then, 36 out of the 54 party list groups in the Philippines have links to political dynasties. So that number, right, 36 out of 54, that was an incumbent number, right, from the 19th Congress, so the one that is currently in recess. And Contra Daya, an election watchdog in the Philippines, released a study literally like 6 hours ago that revealed 86 of the 156 party list groups eligible to participate in the party list elections have links with political dynasties, big businesses, police or military, have pending corruption cases, have dubious advocacy, or do not provide enough information to the public about their groups. So the electoral and legislative power of these underrepresented groups have been further diluted in favor of granting even more power to the ruling elite, right? So these are groups that traditionally do not even have any sort of power in the legislature at all, and the party list system was implemented so they would gain even like a little bit of power from that, right? I know it all seems so very hopeless right now, but please stay on this call. Things will get better, and we will see how the Filipino people can overcome this and fight back. Fingers crossed. And I'll pass it over to Dean.
Thank you, Arthur. Hi everyone, Adine again. I'm based in LA, by the way, part of the Los Angeles chapter. So we're gonna go into again, like what's like the political landscape and the significance of the midterm elections. Can you go to the next slide? Um, well, one important thing happening in this current landscape in the Philippines is the political rivalry or warring really between the Marcos dynasty and the Duterte dynasty, specifically between Bongbong and Sara. Um, and Sara, who is in impeachment proceedings right now, as Arthur was saying, and whose impeachment actually passed the House of Representatives in the Philippines. And of course, if people have been watching along or paying attention to the news and the narratives that's coming out of the Philippines, folks know it's really um, uh, the past several months have been such a stage for drama and clownery between these two. Um, yeah, that's like pretty much something a big thing that is a primary factor that's going on in the politics of the Philippines currently. Can you go to the next slide and the next? So amid that, of course, again, it's a political system ruled by the moneyed and the landed elite in the Philippines. So this chart just demonstrates some of the names that have been pumping just obscene amounts of money in campaigning in the Philippines right now. Folks can see at the top Camille Villar, Amy Marcos, who's, as folks know, Bongbong's sister, have actually broken the threshold of 1 billion pesos in their campaigning. And of course, they're using their own money for campaigning, and their donors are equally the wealthy class in the Philippines. Can you go to the next slide, please? And the next. Okay. Yes, and just a political cartoon again. Folks know that vote buying is the regular order of the day in the Philippines in every election. You go to the next slide. And this, we're not going to go through every single name, but just wanted to demonstrate to folks who are the actors and who is running in the Senate, the the 2025 midterm race, and specifically the Senate. So folks can see under the column of association, these folks are, again, members of political dynasties, families who's been in the political elite for generations, as part of the family business per se. We go to the next slide. Yes, so same thing. Y'all can see the pattern here. Political dynasty, if not a political dynasty, a celebrity. We go to the next slide. Yes, just to drive the point home. Now, all of this is obviously occurring um, in a crisis in the Philippines, in an economic crisis, a human rights crisis, and even a crisis in that spells war in the region. So just to demonstrate a bit, folks can see in this chart, uh, um, this is the family, or the green legend indicates the family living wage per region in the Philippines, or rather, the wage that will ensure the survival of an average family of 5 in the Philippines. And as folks can see, compared to that, the actual regional wages in the Philippines don't even come close to the family living wage in to the family living wage. So wages are stagnant, prices are just soaring, and of course, um, jobs are equally stagnant, and that results in just this exodus of Filipinos out of the country to find jobs abroad. We go to the next slide. And in addition to that, the again, like the current mode of operations in the government is, instead of changing some fundamental problems in the Philippines, it goes out of its way to even deny these problems. So I know it's a lot of text and screenshots right now, but just wanted to demonstrate, for example, on the left-hand side, this was a huge controversy of um, the claim or announcement that if an individual back home spends 64 pesos in a day for food, then they're not considered food poor. But we know that's ridiculous. You cannot survive on 64 pesos in a day for food. You are actually blanketly like starving. But of course, like government operations, they tend to manipulate these statistics to downplay the actual problems in the Philippines. So another example is employment in the Philippines. Government statistics will claim a specific statistic that actually like blurs the real number. So this is just from 2019, and it still stands today. A comparison. Government data would say that unemployed folks are just 5.2% of the population, but that is because it is a deliberate decision to no longer count people who cannot or have not have opted out of looking for jobs just because there are no jobs in the Philippines. They don't count people who are self-employed, but self-employed through desperation. So vending. They don't count folks who are also working for these desperate outfits with family and are not getting paid for it. So there's just specific and very deliberate measures to downplay these numbers in the Philippines. And of course, we're coming out of one of the worst years in terms of disasters in the disasters back home, when we were hit repeatedly back to back by typhoons that resulted in more than 100 people dead back home. and hundreds of thousands displaced, and all because, and of course, the Philippine state will chalk it up to climate change, but does not um, uh, does not hold itself accountable to the fact that all of this is very preventable. The Philippines actually has the resources to be able to prevent these floodings, to be able to prevent, like, yeah, disasters to reach this degree. But of course, those resources in the Philippines go straight into politicians' pockets time and time again. Can you go to the next slide? Um, and these are just snippets again of what's happening um, uh, in the background and surrounding of this election. Of course, there's a human rights crisis, a reason why Malaya movement was founded in the first place. There's indiscriminate aerial bombings happening in the countryside in the Philippines. Here highlighted 173 cases of aerial bombardment, artillery fire, and strafing by military against civilians in the Philippine government's recycled counterinsurgency programs, like in from one administration to another. You go to the next slide. A form of human rights violations in the Philippines. Again, that's just a an MO of the Philippine government, are enforced disappearances. An example of are these two women on the screen, two environmental activists, Jed Tamano and Junila Castro, who were abducted for their advocacy for against the Manila Bay reclamation, but who then defied the Philippine military and actually came out with their story despite danger to their lives. And the headline says it: activists keep disappearing in Marcoses, Philippines. Go to the next slide, please. In terms of the state of democracy in the Philippines, one example is the targeted repression of the freedom of speech and assembly. One recent case is the charging of um, uh, progressive candidates who are running for Senate, specifically the Makabayan bloc, Makabayan Senate candidates running in May, uh, who had organized or participated in a rally, a protest in Lewasang Bonifacio in Manila. And for that, they were charged with illegal assembly. So just these, like, infringement of constitutional rights, basic rights, that's specifically targeted to people who progressive individuals who are taking the government to task and holding the government accountability for its repressive, undemocratic policies. Go to the next slide. And then just the status quo, some status quo practices in the Philippines that indicate that the Philippines is standing on, a faux democracy, not a genuine one. Just because it has elections does not mean it's a genuine democracy. Land grabbing by political dynasties and corporations. So just literally infringing on the rights of peasants and regular civilians and citizens of their right to their own land. The creation of the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict in the Philippines, or the NTF-LCAC, and the establishment of the passage of the anti-terror law, both of which are used to smear progressive voices, discredit progressive voices, but even worse, actually putting a target on folks' backs and lives for speaking out against injustice and injustice in the Philippines. And attacks on press freedom, always been a problem under whichever administration in the Philippines. Marcos is absolutely not an exception. Yes, Marcos or Duterte have not been exceptions to this. There were even killings of, or at least a killing of one journalist live on air. And yes, one horrific example. Can we go to the next slide? And just repeating the party list system, like the fact that it even exists and it's manipulated and used in this way, it's supposed to be it's supposed to be a check for on the power and control and power of the landed and political elite in the Philippines to give voice to the marginalized. But that is no longer how it's being played. And as y'all can see in the previous slide that we saw, just the obscene amount of money that's going into this election. The folks who have the most chance at actually gaining political power are the folks who have political power, and again, it's the wealthy elite in the Philippines. You go to the next slide. And of course, there's the issue of the very national and territorial sovereignty of the Philippines. Folks know that there is not just tension, but conflict actually, that the Philippines is dead in the middle of between the United States and China, vying for dominance. Vying for dominance in the Asia Pacific. And of course, that's already affected ordinary Filipino civilians in the day-to-day. The Balikatan exercises, in addition to the environmental destruction and the mere presence of troops, tens of thousands of troops on the ground, also barred entire fishing populations from their livelihood, and the ongoing conflict in the West Philippine Sea. Yes, that also both the United States and China are rivaling parties of, and again the Philippines being I guess just following pretty much on marching orders of the United States. Can we go to the next slide? And so much so that there's the issue of the West Philippine Sea, but the really the development of the past several years of trade and now open military conflict between the United States and China. The Philippines is effectively now one big military base for the United States, as y'all can see here. The EDCA, uh, Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, under which the United States can actually um, uh, uh, put boots on the ground and military material in Philippine territory. Those sites have now multiplied. There used to be bases in the Philippines, bases that the Filipino people themselves kicked out in the early 90s. And then now there's the return of these quote EDCA sites, which are de facto bases. So from 0 to 4 and now to 9. And then there's more based on our partners from Bayan, there's more locations that are undeclared. And there's even recently the crash of a spy plane in the Philippines, again indicating that the United States and the Philippine government are surveilling surveilling the Filipino people and surveilling any type of dissent. Yeah. Okay, sorry, still a lot. Can you go to the next slide, please? So in all Amid all of that, the Malaya movement, our three principles are, defending democracy, human rights, and sovereignty in the Philippines, and establishing genuine democracy, genuine sovereignty in the Philippines. That's just a reminder of why, like, we have are putting on this educational discussion, and reminder of why it is crucial for us to be participating in this election. With that said, can we go to the next slide? So amid all of these issues, big ticket issues in the Philippines that clearly the mainstream politicians are not addressing in any genuine way, there are actually now in the senatorial race in the Philippines, genuine progressives who are running for Senate, and historic, if I may say. These folks are running under the Makabayan, yes, the Makabayan, make up the Makabayan bloc in the Philippines, each of whom are representatives who are actually part of the basic sectors in the Philippines. Someone from the labor movement, Jerome, someone who is in healthcare, a nurse, Jocelyn, a fisherman, Ronel, etc. Folks who are actually part of the basic sectors in the Philippines and not part of political dynasties, not media celebrities, and folks who have a long, long, long track record of advocacy for genuine progressive policy, and a long, long record of standing up against uh, repressive policies in the Philippines. Malaya movement actually, recently we united to endorse the Makabayan candidates for 2025, to give us to give the the marginalized communities of the Philippines a fighting chance in this election. Can we go to the next slide? At the same time, there's also the Bayan Muna party list, an actual party list that represents the marginalized and not the um, uh, the kind of like the bastardization of the party list system in the Philippines. With these candidates, feel free to look them up. I actually personally met some of them, folks who are coming from indigenous communities, a survivor of martial law, someone from the an environmental, someone from the climate justice movement in the Philippines. Again, candidates that Malaya ourselves have endorsed. Yes, there's a light, there's a shining light in the elections for this year. And these are, thank you, these a summary of the Makabayan Bloc's platform. It's much longer than this, but just to give y'all a top lines, a summary of things that we won't find in the other candidates, in the mainstream candidates in the Philippines. So again, running on livelihood, services for all, actual genuine sovereignty that isn't contingent on a superpower, um, uh, 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 climate justice, genuine peace in the Philippines that's based on justice, based on the upholding of rights of Filipinos, um, uh, uh, genuine representation for specific marginalized communities in the Philippines, and yes, democratic leadership and a culture that serves nationalist culture, meaning a culture that serves the people of the Philippines and not superpowers that aim to infringe on our sovereignty. Yes, so that was a mouthful, but I think I will pass it next to the Teresa now.
Thank you, Audine. Can y'all hear me okay? Just want to make sure. Yeah. Okay. Um, Great. Yeah, so, we learned about the history of elections in the Philippines and then also um what's at stake for the midterm elections, including, yeah, like the impeachment proceedings of Sara Duterte and how, that will resume after the elections. And also we've, seen the shining light, as Adine said, of um the Makabayan candidates and the Bayan Muna party list. Um, and now we'll go into a little bit of a critical view on the elections, the issues and limitations, which a couple of people have already started, commenting in the chat earlier. But let's go to the next slide. So, the three G's of Philippine politics. I was going to ask what y'all thought the three G's were, but it's already on the slides. So, gold, goons, and guns. In 1969, Ferdinand Marcos Sr., resorted to strategies like vote buying, ballot snatching, and straight up violence to secure his position as president. And journalists were actually able to popularize the phrase guns, goons, and gold and use that to describe the culture of Philippine elections. But guess what? Although this was coined years and years and years ago, we can still see how this phrase rings true today. And if we go to the next slide. So first, let's talk about the gold and the goons. What is vote buying and selling? Earlier, Arthur had mentioned vote buying and selling already, but to kind of do a little deep dive on it, vote buying and vote selling is when a person offers promises or gives money or anything of value directly or indirectly in order to vote for or against a candidate, and also to withhold their vote. And a lot of the times, candidates tend to shield themselves from liability, and they're able to convince individuals to commit the transaction. For some numbers, in 2022, during the last elections, Comelec was investigating 1,000 cases of vote buying with validated reports across Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. In Agusan del Sur, for example, candidates were buying votes from 1,000 pesos to 3,500 pesos, and some candidates were shelling out 500 pesos to each person at the precinct on election day itself. There are also accounts of police seizing 50,000 pesos in a vote buying operation, and there were others who were arrested. And they were carrying bundles of like 2,500 pesos in cash. So at the lowest end, that's around $8. For 3,000 pesos, that's around $51. As mentioned earlier, right, most Filipinos try to survive on barely a day. So $51, like just given to you, seemingly randomly, right? That's a lot. And you can really see how the moneyed and landed elite really prey on the socioeconomic status of many Filipinos, right? Kind of the really long and heightened economic crisis, that's really, like setting the stage for vote buying and vote selling to happen. So, we got the goons and we got the gold, but this kind of bribery doesn't always secure a candidate's seat. So what happens? Surprise, it's guns. So in 2009, I think folks, maybe like raise your hand or put an emoji in the chat if you've heard about the Maguindanao massacre in 2009. Um, while, people raise their hands or drop an emoji in the chat, um, the world the Maguindanao massacre is basically the world's deadliest single attack on journalists and the worst case of election-based violence in the Philippines, and it took place in the town of Ampatuan in Mindanao. And kind of the TLDR of this is that one of the convoys of a potential politician, Esmael Mango Dadatu, and it wasn't actually him. It was like relatives and also a lot of journalists stopped in a town that was ruled by the Ampatuan clan. And as a political dynasty, they held multiple political seats, and their family's political power could be traced to the support of Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, who was the president then. And as you can see here, there were 58 individuals who were killed in the massacre, including 32 journalists. And this case would go on for 10 years. And, a couple years ago in 2019, there was finally a guilty verdict for the brothers Datu Andal Jr. and Zaldi Ampatuan. And that's just one example, right? We can also see kind of recently in 2022, there were also instances of election based violence. In Ilocos Sur, for example, there was a shooting that happened between rival groups who were vying for mayor. In Lanao del Sur, there were people storming a voting center and destroying ballots and machines. And as this was happening, the Philippine government deployed 270,000 police and military to kind of monitor these situations and provide security. But as we know from like what we heard from Audine, the police and military don't really care about protecting actual people, but instead protecting the state of the landed and moneyed elite, especially at a time of elections. And that leads us to, if we go to the next slide, please, um, how else can we see Philippine elections tampered with? So we got the gold, the goons, and the guns. Then we also have fraud and manipulation. Um, we can see that this is a common trend throughout Philippine history. For example, in the 1949 elections, where after Quirino was elected as president, votes were fabricated so much that journalists said that the votes were coming from the birds, the bees, and the flowers, that they were just coming from everywhere, and that the ballots were padded to comical proportions. We also see it in the 1986 Marcos versus Aquino elections, that pro-government and pro-Marcos newspapers would report on a false lead that Marcos had. And these lies resulted in many employee walkouts whose jobs were to observe and count the votes. And there were even international groups of observers who identified the cases of fraud done by Marcos and his supporters. Um, this election occurred in the early February of 1986, which was kind of careening towards the end of martial law in the Philippines, and it's not a surprise why Marcos would scramble to really hold tightly onto that power. Um, but that's not all. If we go to the next slide, you know, couple of years later, we get the Hello Garci scandal of the Arroyo presidency. And the kind of the short version of this is that there was a leaked recording of a conversation between then President GMA and the election commissioner, where she was asking for confirmation regarding a 1 million vote lead against her political opponent. Um, though she confirmed that it was actually her voice, she denied that any cheating took place. And following the scandal, there were 3 impeachment trials, which all failed. And Arroyo did not only complete her presidency, she also continued and strengthened her political career in Congress. Um, and Arroyo, although she was in detention for 4 years between 2012 and 2016, she was ultimately acquitted by the influence of Duterte, and her political career, surprise or not, continued. She was later appointed the House of Representatives. It really shows that she literally was not punished or held accountable for her crimes. Instead, she continued to flourish. And if we go to the next slide, another example of election fraud and manipulation involves the rise of automated machines, which were introduced in 2020. 2010. So, almost like more than a decade now. There are a lot of issues associated with automated voting machines. Originally, they were introduced to counter fraud. However, new problems took place. There were a lot of machine malfunctions, things like paper jamming or rejecting ballots. And even, years later in 2010, when there were 82 enhancements that were made in preparation, irregularities still occurred. People's votes were not counted, ballot receipts didn't reflect what they actually cast, and that probably what's most suspicious is that the server also stopped sending real-time results for hours to the media when they were supposed to be sent every 15 minutes. Um, Comelec also finalized a contract with this logistics company, F2 Logistics, and it has ties to one of Duterte's highest campaign donors, Dennis Uy, but Comelec was like, no, there's no conflict of interest. But as we see that in a high stakes election where alliances are really important and people want to hold tightly onto their power, people can't help but disagree. And there are also examples of how kind of the role of influence on public perception of candidates by utilizing data accessed from Facebook to target individuals for political campaigns. And you can kind of see this example of Cambridge Analytica. But wait, there's more. And if we go to the next slide, so in 2022, during the last elections, there were a lot of vote counting machine breakdowns. You can see in the graphic from Contradaya that 1,800 voting machines, which was 1.8% of the units, had issues during the first 4 hours of voting, and 168 were defective. These were the same machines from Smartmatic used in the past elections, 2016 and 2019, and it caused 864 million pesos to refurbish and lease more units. So you can see that, like these examples of like breakdowns and these examples of ways that votes were just simply not counted still occurred even with the spending of this much money. And there were also the allegations of bribery between the former Comelec chairman and Smartmatic from 2015 to 2018 about this kind of corruption in the vote counting machine breakdown as just one example. But let's move to the next slide. So there are also other ways that we can kind of see how issues might arise in Philippine elections. So one such way is substitutions, which basically is to put field placeholder candidates to make last minute changes. And you kind of do this intentionally. And sure, there are these circumstances where political parties can substitute candidates. There's death, disqualification by Comelec, and withdrawal. But really, we see this as a kind of political theater where you use this as a strategy to drum up public demand, hype certain people up, and buy time for aspiring candidates. This was criticism for Duterte's back and forth in 2016, the will he, won't he run, and some argue that this is also what was done for Sara Duterte. So you can kind of see like how, this like continues kind of in the, like the circus of the Philippine elections. And if we go to the next slide, the power of disinformation. The next couple of slides kind of talk about the power of disinformation. And to kind of set the stage, 83% of Filipinos are on the internet and they spend the most time on the internet. So that's 4 hours and 5 minutes a day, and nearly half of Filipinos get news from the internet. And, this happens because paywalls and subscription services to access news make social media most accessible. Celebrity culture overlaps with politics. You can see that with examples like Manny Pacquiao, and um, YouTube also and Facebook also have like loose policies on disinformation. That means that disinformation can stream freely, as well as really seeing like yeah, really seeing as like social media as the place where people get a lot of their information. And in the chat, there's also the list of Malaya's campaign on disinformation, against disinformation and the weaponization of social media. And if we go to the next slide, here's more Facebook. So Facebook has a very deep relationship with the Philippines and Filipinos. I'm sure you yourself or somebody you know is on Facebook, right? Maybe your parents, your titos, your cousins. And that's not a mistake. That's not random that Facebook is like, where you can find a lot of Filipinos. In 2013, Facebook launched a free internet initiative in the Philippines, which allowed access to the internet to Filipinos of all socioeconomic backgrounds. And of course, that means using Facebook and using Facebook Messenger. Um, 88 million users, or 78% of the whole population of the Philippines, is on Facebook. And Facebook is also, as a platform, has become a breeding ground for ample disinformation. It's also, like one of the companies that's really trying to monopolize a lot of telecommunications, here in the US. And the Facebook algorithm skews what people see on their feeds, sometimes really pushing out false information into the hands of the millions, though that there might be third-party fact checkers. There are loopholes on things like Facebook Messenger. And if we go to the next slide, so that's kind of the breeding ground, right? Surely that means things will be great on the internet, right? Not quite. How has this been weaponized? We can see kind of two quick examples. One is the Duterte's troll army in 2016, and also kind of the rise of disinformation in the 2022 elections. And who does this impact, right? People who are new to social media, people who, for very many like systematic reasons, do not have that much media literacy. Again, kind of as it's part of, has it's baked into the system. People who are newly interested in politics or their country, and also marginalized groups. Um, how exactly has the power of Facebook really been seized by this? His social media team, Duterte, for example, knew that they didn't have funds for TV or radio or billboards. And you can see that other politicians have so much money to kind of, really throw out at these traditional forms of communication, as we saw earlier with Inaudine's part. So Duterte was really able to utilize a troll army to create fake sites, accounts, and materials that could smear the legitimacy of political rivals versus via memes or posts. And like, because people were sharing and reacting and commenting, the algorithm worked in his favor, and kind of created this image of him as a strong man and really built this big database. And we not database, this online fan base. And we can see that too in the 2022 elections, when, kind of we're coming out of the pandemic. A lot of people have been really using internet to stay connected. And there's also, again, like kind of the really deep connection of celebrity culture, which now like contains both like traditional celebrities in the Philippines, but now also kind of like influencer and micro influencer culture, and their relationship to politics. And if we go to the next slide, um, we can also see kind of the rise of historical revisionism in the 2022 elections. And this is not new. Essentially, the Marcoses and their allies have really had like decades long campaigns for historical revisionism to kind of paint Marcos and the martial law era as as the golden years. But we can see kind of a new flavor in 2022 with kind of micro influencers promoting, pushing to create and promote content that would really promote Marcos Jr. since 2021. And Marcos Jr. himself denied the presence of troll farms, despite evidence otherwise. And we can also see the attacks on journalists in 2022, the attacks on textbooks, even kind of like the attacks on textbooks and the way that the educational system is built, and really seeing how, it gets like really heightened, especially, through the through social media. And if we see the next slide, so this was a word that I think a couple of people put in the chat earlier, on voter disenfranchisement. And we, kind of like two things to highlight here. One is really thinking about the struggle for overseas voters. For example, in 2022, the proposed budget for overseas voting was reduced from 831 million pesos to 111 million pesos. And also consequently its allocation for prepaid postage, also really shot down from 160 million pesos to 6 million pesos. So we had people who had to pay to send over their ballots. I remember I paid for my ballot when I sent it. But there were also other issues, right? Although there was a 2-week extension to register for voting, a lot of people, were still unable to get paid time off. A lot of registration centers are very far. There was also a lot of COVID impact on registration and the ability to register. There was also, because and through that, the suspension of voter registration for almost 6 months. And there was a survey that Filipinos 46% would skip elections if COVID cases were high. And I remember like waiting to kind of register for voting at one of the consulates, and I came there at 11, and basically already people were at lunch and I couldn't register for like 2 hours after. Even though like lunch was supposed to be from like 12 to 12:30. So, little examples like that, right? And then now, as Arthur mentioned earlier, there's the added layer of online voting. Um, there's yeah, so like what are the guarantees of the integrity of the votes? So right, one, you need a device that's connected to the internet and to take photos, and kind of the big claim is that you can vote, from the convenience of your electronic devices. And Comelec was like, there's going to be some security features. You'll provide a password, you'll upload an ID, there's photo capturing for identity verification. And there was also like a statement from the consul general in New York, who said that there are safety and security measures in place similar to online banking transactions. But what those safety and security measures are, we need to call for transparency. And it's also important to note that in 2021, when the Comelec was really trying to push for um, the possibility of online elections for like in 2021, so years ago, they had made a partnership with Votes, a US startup, that provides like voting platforms. But that startup, and its platform were flagged by MIT for basically like poor security and like susceptibility for altering, stopping, or exposing votes. Right, so we can already see that there are issues that would come with online voting, and it is important to call for transparency, to see what exactly security and safety measures would take place. um, and if we see, um, we've said a lot, right? With all this information and examples, what can we gather, right? What are the limitations of elections, which are meant to be a pillar of democracy? And we really see that, we see through history and through the present that elections have been mainly a playground for those already in power and wealth, those who have money, those who have land, and then the children that they create to continue that cycle. And through that, people, are vulnerable to manipulation, vulnerable to things like vote buying because of the dire economic conditions in the Philippines, where many people live in staggering poverty. So these conditions really feed into the breadth of manipulation. Then there's the rise of disinformation, both kind of through, the pumping out of billions of pesos on ads, and historical revisionism, and also this added flavor of social media, but also the celebrity culture, the culture of impunity, and political dynasties. However, and it's not all doom and gloom, history also shows us that elections can be a time when many people are engaged, even for the first time, in social issues. And that's exciting, and really emphasizing that people are the agents of change. And that when people are organized and conscious, they can really, yeah, they can really make change happen. And it's through the active participation of people that the cause of human rights, democracy, and sovereignty will be advanced. Organizing is a right and duty. We see this right with, the example of walkouts, during, like the 1986 Marcos versus Aquino elections. We really see that, history shows us that people are able to enact change, people are able to come together and advance the causes of human rights, democracy, and sovereignty. So, like these are a lot of issues and, limitations, but also really showing us what, people power, can do. So with that, I'm gonna pass it to Gila for our calls to action.
Okay, thank you so much. Can you guys hear me okay? Great. So, um, first, let's get some emojis in the chat. If you believe that people are the agent of change, if you believe in power in the people, you should put an emoji in the chat as we go through our calls to action. Beautiful, amazing. So we're almost at the end. So I'm here to give you some tangible actions to think about, because knowing that people are the agent of change, there are many things that you can do for these upcoming elections. So the first and most important step, especially if you are registered to vote for these midterm elections, is become an active participant by voting, and specifically help us by voting for the Makabayan block. On top of that, what you're doing right now is being an active participant by joining us in this discussion. You're engaging in dialogues with the community. And on top of that, you're just trying to learn. And that's usually the most important thing when it comes to being an active participant. On top of that, if participating in elections is just the key to defending democracy and resisting fascism, as we've learned, organizing is usually another best way. But we're going to break this down into levels. So you've become an active participant. What can you do next? You can engage in political action. And this starts with just calling for accountability. As you continue to engage in discussions and learn, fight against that mis and disinformation. Leverage trusted and independent sources for information when you can, rely on evidence, and even make sure you're avoiding doom scrolling. You can also demand for a clean and honest election. But for change to happen, change happens through the masses. And so when we say you should get organized, at least for this call, we're recommending you get organized with us. So we're going to quickly go through Malaya's 8-point program. So going back to who we are, the Malaya Movement USA program outlines the long-term goals and visions for a genuinely democratic, just, and sovereign Philippines. With our 3 principles, we uphold the view that the issues faced by the Filipino people are rooted in long-standing and systemic economic and political issues that create widespread poverty and hardship for millions of Filipinos. These dire conditions are bolstered by fascism that has seeped its way into civilian bureaucracy and military institutions. Furthermore, fascism has become intertwined with the Philippine government, exemplified during the dictatorship of Marcos Sr. to the counterinsurgency programs of each president thereafter, Duterte's strongman authoritarian rule, to present day under Marcos Jr. As a result of these systems, we're witness to widespread repression against dissent, violence through military and police, and the suppression of the rights of the people. For these reasons, we as Malaya work together to unite the broadest number of Filipinos to advance human rights, democracy, and sovereignty, and to defeat fascism in the Philippines. So by no means is this an easy nor small task, so we break out our plan through an 8-point program. So you have one, pursue genuine democracy in the Philippines by systematically fighting for and defending the human rights, civil liberties, and welfare of all people, especially marginalized classes and sectors. Two is to fight for and defend the Philippine sovereignty by pursuing domestic and foreign policy that will realize full economic, political, and military independence for the Filipino people. Three is to implement a national comprehensive social program that is pro people, science based, and respects human rights. And four is to promote a national economic program that will democratize economic security for all, not just a small few in the Philippines. Five is to end government corruption and eliminate the undemocratic hold on the government by political dynasties. Six is to promote and pursue a just and lasting peace in the Philippines. Seven is to hold the Marcos and Duterte political dynasties and their cronies accountable for their crimes against the Filipino people. And eight is to promote and build solidarity against rising fascism around the world. Now, you'll still be saying, Gila, that's a lot. That's so big. Where are we starting? Well, guess what? We have something for you. If you're very interested in joining Malaya or supporting us, we have our 7th year anniversary fundraiser. Put some emojis in the chat to celebrate us being at 7 years. I'm getting too hyped in my own room. But yeah, so we have an upcoming fundraiser stream on Friday, February 28th, starting at 5:30 p.m. Pacific time, 8:30 p.m. Eastern time. If you join us for this special live stream, you'll get to learn more about our past achievements and what happens when we work together and continue fighting for the masses. Of course, for our 7th year anniversary, we're trying to raise $7,000, so make sure to tune in. This is a call out to our chapters. We are looking for submissions for culturals, so please submit if you're interested. We'd love to feature you. On top of that, solidarity orgs are also welcome to submit statements. We're also looking for auction items. And for those who are gamers, we are planning a future Twitch stream as well. So you should definitely reach out to help. Everyone has a role in this anniversary fundraiser, and we totally want to highlight all of you. Again, this is one of the best ways to just start out learning more about who Malaya is and where you can fit in the grand scheme of things, because every action you take is important, no matter how small. So before we go into questions and answers, remember, the best thing you can do is to get organized. And so you can either do that by first getting organized as a member of Malaya Movement USA. We have the link up here, but you can also scan that QR code for that. Again, to emphasize the fact that we are endorsing the Makabayan bloc, join the U.S. Filipinos for Makabayan community, and that link is also on this slide. And finally, as I said, make sure to stay engaged and continue learning. So stay tuned for future educational discussions by following us on our social media or even emailing us. And so that said, thank you so much for tuning in. We're going to go into some questions. Before we put any more questions in the chat or say them out loud, I will read some of the questions that we've already responded to. So the first question we got was, has the GRP provided any guidance procedures on how online vote manipulation will be prevented? And can one of the facilitators please respond?
Yeah. Yes, so they gave some assurances, but nothing really concrete on what that looks like. Again, it was the quote about like similar to online banking transactions, and that there are also like um vague security measures for like when voters enroll on the platform, like, you know, having a password, uploading an ID, and then photo capturing. But yeah, uncertain on the specifics. So, you know, like we should also like really try to call for transparency and seeing like what those actual measures are, given the history of voter fraud and manipulation in the elections from 1949 to now. So, yeah, if others also want to add.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Is voting eligibility within 1 year prior to the election or at least 1 year in lifetime? Facilitators?
Um, Gila, do you mind going back to like slide number 12 or something? I don't know. But like the slide that showed like the voting eligibility requirements?
Yep, give me 1 second. That's gonna be a hot minute.
Yeah, so basically what the slide shows is like two things. The first, okay, we're getting close. There you go. Yeah, so the first bullet point is what it's laid out in the Constitution. And the second bullet point is how the registration law is systematized and codified in Philippine penal code. So what it means by the first part is if you're voting in the Philippines, you have to have been there for at least 1 year prior to the elections or 1 year prior to the registration. And if you're voting overseas, then it doesn't really matter because 10% of the Filipino population lives outside of the Philippines. So on paper, at least, they want it to be as accessible to as many Filipinos as possible. Hope that answers that question. But if you haven't voted for two consecutive elections, then your registration becomes it becomes deactivated, so you have to re-register with Comlec. But once you register, unless you move to a different place, your registration will stand as long as you're voting regularly every election.
Thank you. Okay, next question. Are there any examples of specific resources that are not being funded to prevent disasters? Do any of our facilitators have an answer?
Yeah, I can try to answer that. The thing is, the Philippine government and the national budget will um, always claim that there is allocation or like a good allocation for flooding in the Philippines. Yeah, following the floods, I don't know, Marcos was claiming, oh, we invested blah, 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 like this much and we're ready. And as folks know, like we're not ready. We've never been ready. There was never a time we were ready for floods of like this degree. Um, uh, like a demonstration of like just the gap between spending but then like the actual implementation. I think uh while like a lot of areas were really affected and was just like covered in flood water, areas that are rich, you will see like these photos of BGC just like hit by a light rain, you know, because the infrastructure around those rich, well resourced areas is just, actually meets the standards of like, okay, yeah, we don't want flooding in this like very lucrative area part of the country. Um, so I'll start with that. Um, Now, uh, in terms of actual the question of, oh, where's resources not going or going, the thing is that a corrupt government does not track itself, is not transparent, will not monitor itself. It's not going to say, oh, these are the things that we did not invest in and we did invest in. So like it then becomes a matter of pulling facts that are known and like, offering like actually like pulling the truth from those facts. So if we're talking about like, oh, where's the budget going, there's a lot of places the public money is going that shouldn't have that much resources, like for example the confidential intelligence funds in the Philippines, where there's just this like, you know uh, a pocket or pool of money that specific offices can use to do surveillance, but then like it's not actually monitored or it's not actually tracked. If folks see like the national budget of the Philippines that's passed every uh, even just this last one, there's a decrease in general of funding for basic services, for health, for education, etc. Um, but then like an increase in military and counterinsurgency. So it's a long answer, but I just, unfortunately, It's not like we can give people a line item of like, okay, it's going here and it's not going there, because that's the reality of the Philippine government. It does not, it's a it's a corrupt system, and corruption does not, reveal itself or track itself, or give you receipts. Even like Sara Duterte was like founded to have fraudulent receipts of like her spending of her confidential intelligence funds. So yeah, sorry, long answer, but it's just a matter of pulling like more of these facts, so that we can paint a picture for folks, and not, yeah, it'll take like deep investigative journalism to be like, oh, did this go to this item and not this item, etc., etc. If that makes sense.
I believe it did. Thank you. Next question is just how does one check to see if they're registered to vote?
So I'm gonna send a link in the chat real quick. This is the link to the Kamalek website. So you just want to go to the Kamalek website and you want to search for your consulate or your embassy. And then once you click on that, you should be able to search for your name, and that's how you'll be able to see if you're registered or not.
Thank you. Next question is what is the difference between a senatorial slate versus a party list? How do votes translate to how many seats they hold?
Um, we're gonna talk about some algebra, some trigonometry. It's a process. So basically in the Philippines, a voter, when you have a ballot with you, um, specifically during the midterms, you can fill out 12 names for senators, so you can get to vote for 12 senators. It's okay, Christina. So you get to go vote for 12 senators. A party list is basically if you're in the Philippines, right? You're voting for a congressperson locally, and you're voting for a party list representative. So you essentially get 2 votes in Congress. The party list vote is it's hard to explain, but basically you're not voting for a person, you're voting for a party. You're voting for a sector, right? So if you're a women, I'm gonna use the Makabayan back for example. Personally, when I was living in the Philippines, I voted straight for the Kabataan party list, the youth party list, because I'm young. Um, so I would vote for the youth. So I would have youth representation, sectoral representation in Congress. What that means is, but that formula to that is that the COMELEC will take all the votes cast nationwide, and then all of the party lists that receive more than 2% of the votes will be given a seat. Depending on how many percentage points of the votes they receive, they may receive more than 1 seat, but not more than 3 seats. So a party list can have maximum 3 representatives in Congress. And then once you hit the once you distribute seats to all of the party lists that have more than 2% of the vote, how many ever seats are left are distributed to like the next party lists that come up. It's a there's a formula to it. There's a reason why I studied like health sciences and not math. But yeah, there's you can definitely like look it up. It's a hard thing to look up online, but if you just keep going through those like rabbit holes, you'll find it at some point. But it's a formula. Yeah.
Thank you so
I hope
much.
that answered that question. I was very all over the place.
Thank you. Okay. I know we are looking over time, but if you guys have any last minute questions, now's the chance to bring it up.
I think we can end here then, right?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Thank you all again so much. I hope this was enlightening to folks, and again, like we don't just have to stand by and let all of these things, issues in the Philippines, or issues of corruption like overtake us, and we can get organized. That's what Malaya movement is doing. That's what some of the organizations here are already doing. So yes, join Malaya movement, have others join Malaya movement, get your neighbors and whoever else to join as a member. The campaigning season is in full swing, so please join the US Filipinos for Makabayan, in which Malaya will be participating significantly. And yeah, stay tuned again for more of these educational discussions, or help us do one yourself by joining as Malaya. um, and that is it. Thank you all so much for coming on, and yeah, I hope folks have a good night, and see y'all at the next new member orientation if you sign up to be a Malaya member. That's it. Thanks, y'all.